Jujutsu Kaisen has a lot of curse techniques, and while most aren't that complicated, almost all of them are poorly explained. So I thought it would be nice, now that we know every single curse technique, to fix that by explaining all of them. We're going to be going in the order that techniques are introduced, meaning we're starting with Megumi and his 10 Shadows technique. The 10 Shadows technique is one of the coveted inherited techniques from the big 3 clans of Jujutsu Society. It allows the user to create 10 different Shikigami out of shadows by making hand signs for the respective Shikigami. Each Shikigami must be tamed via a taming ritual, with the exception of divine dogs, which are gifted to the user upon the technique's manifestation. The 10 shadows are Nue, an electric bird that can stun opponents and carry its users small distances; Toad, a toad that is rather large and can use its tongue to grab things, including people; Great Serpent, a snake that can bite an opponent to restrain them; Max Elephant, an elephant Shikigami that can eject water from its spout and be used as a weight; Rabbit Escape, a mass of rabbits that are mainly used to distract opponents or obscure the user; Round Deer, a deer that emits positive energy, healing itself and nullifying cursed energy it comes in contact with; Piercing Ox, an ox that will gain strength the longer it runs in one direction; and of course, the strongest Shikigami, Mahoraga. Mahoraga is not only the strongest Shikigami in the 10 Shadows, but one of the strongest beings in the show, period. It has the ability to adapt to any and all phenomena it experiences, meaning that unless you beat it quickly, it will adapt to your technique and beat you pretty easily. It was strong enough to go toe-to-toe with 15-finger Sukuna and even gave Gojo some trouble. On top of this, it also has the Sword of Extermination, which is a cursed tool imbued with positive energy, allowing it to one-shot any cursed spirit. If you can count, you might have noticed that this was only 9 Shikigami, and that's because the 10th one, Tiger Funeral, we know literally nothing about besides its name. While these Shikigami are powerful, there's more to them than just their individual abilities. Each one's strength can be altered by the user's interpretation of the shadows, with stronger users usually yielding stronger interpretations. On top of this, the Shikigami can also be combined to alter their uses and improve their strengths. And as if that wasn't enough, the shadows themselves also provide a good amount of utility as well, as they can be used to trap people, store cursed weapons, and more. There's a reason this technique is coveted by the Zenin clan, but it's time to move on to another coveted technique, the Limitless technique, belonging of course to Gojo Satoru. The Limitless technique at its core draws out cursed energy at an atomic level and uses that manipulation as its base. There are 4 main abilities within Limitless. First is Infinity, which is limitless in its neutral state. Infinity basically creates an impenetrable force field around the user. From a conceptual standpoint, that's really all you need to know, but the way it really works is by constantly slowing down anything that enters its area of effect, to the point that it will never reach Gojo. Some people also interpret this ability as putting infinite space between its target and the attack, but you can interpret it however you like. Infinity is also apparently able to sense poison and prevent it from affecting its user. Limitless also has 3 techniques that are mostly geared for offense. The first is Blue, which attracts things to the user with a strong magnetic-like force. At its maximum, it is able to destroy a whole courtyard or one-shot a combined Shikigami. Next is Red, which repels its target at high speed. This is the curse technique reversal of Blue and requires twice as much cursed energy to use, but in general is more powerful. And finally is Purple, which is the combination of Red and Blue. It is a blast that can destroy pretty much anything it comes in contact with, and it is among the strongest attacks in the show, as I'm sure you can tell. On top of this, Limitless users can also teleport, but the ability does have one flaw. It requires the 6 eyes to use. But even with this, it's still insanely broken. Speaking of broken, next is Sukuna's Shrine. It's kind of crazy how some of the best abilities were introduced first like this. Anyway, Shrine is split into 3 parts, inspired by a kitchen. The first 2 are Cleave and Dismantle. These are 2 slashing attacks with very different purposes. Dismantle slashes at 1 set strength, and as such is mostly used on weaker opponents and inanimate objects. Cleave, on the other hand, is able to be adjusted to cut down any opponent in one shot, making it perfect for opponents with cursed energy. And finally, there's Furnace, which for the longest time was the black box technique. This ability is essentially just an extremely strong fire arrow. I don't know why Gege decided to hide this ability when it's just that simple. It's a dope ability, and it's super strong. I just thought it was a bit underwhelming for all the mystery behind it. Next is Nobara and her Straw Doll technique. This technique is pretty simple, and it revolves around Nobara's hammer and nails, with the technique being split into 2 parts. There's Hairpin, which allows Nobara to break any nails she imbues with cursed energy in a powerful explosion, and there's Resonance. Resonance is the most notable aspect. If Nobara has a piece of something imbued with cursed energy, she can use Resonance to affect the original item or person. We see this done with Mahito's body double, Sukuna's finger, and Momo's broom. When used on sentient beings like cursed spirits and humans, it does major damage to both their body and soul, and for cursed tools, it seems to make them not work temporarily. And now we finally have the first cursed spirit with a technique we're introduced to, Jogo, who makes use of fire manipulation. This technique essentially allows Jogo Jogo to control fire and fire-based natural disasters. We mostly see him use this to summon and manipulate lava, but he has a number of other abilities like shooting beams of fire from his hands, these weird little bump things, ember insects which approach an opponent before exploding, and of course the maximum technique Maximum Meteor, which is a meteor about the size of a city block that would do damage to even Sukuna if it hit. Next we have Nanami and his ratio technique. This technique is pretty simple. Anything Nanami uses the technique on will be split into 10 equal segments, and if he hits the line that separates the target into 7 and 3, he does massive damage to his target. This technique is actually later imbued into Nanami's cursed tool, and so we also see it used by Ino. Next we have Nanami's favorite person, Mahito, who makes use of Idle Transfiguration. This ability allows the user to control and contort the soul, altering the body of those that it is used on, including the user themselves. We mostly see Mahito use it to create transfigured humans, which are humans that act in the way Mahito wants them to act. This can be turning them into weapons, turning them into servants that obey Mahito, or just using them to heal himself. It's worth mentioning that just one touch from Mahito is often enough to kill someone, with the only exception being strong sorcerers and Yuji while Sukuna inhabits his body. One of these people was Junepie, who is the next person on our list. Junepie has a pretty basic ability in Moondredge, which is a poisonous jellyfish shikigami. This ability allows him to prey on non-sorcerers, but when it comes to actual sorcerers, it doesn't really do much besides protect him. Now we move on to Panda, who really only has one ability in the form of his brother's technique Unblockable Beating Drum. This ability is used by Panda as the duo share a vessel along with their older sister, whose ability we never see. Unblockable Drumming Beat allows Panda to do internal damage to opponents, as the attack cannot be blocked by physical resistances, but its strength does still seem to be dependent on cursed energy reinforcement. But enough about Panda, let's move on to Panda's BFF, Inumaki, who uses Cursed Speech. This ability is exactly as it sounds. When Inumaki says a word, it is imbued with cursed energy, allowing it to affect the target completely. This could be something simple like don't move, or it could be something more intense like blast away. Any word he says has this capability, but the ability does have some drawbacks, as stronger words cause rebound on the user, damaging their throat. Words used on opponents that are stronger than Inumaki also cause rebound, so when Inumaki uses stronger words on stronger opponents, it can be pretty damaging to him as well. Now it's time to talk about the Kyoto students, starting with Mechamaru, who makes use of puppet manipulation. Puppet manipulation in general allows a user to control puppets, but in Mechamaru's case, it allows him to do so much more because of his heavenly restriction, which gave him a lot of cursed energy at the cost of his body. This allowed him to control puppets over a wider area of effect and also control multiple puppets at once. We mostly see this manifest as his ultimate Mechamaru, but that's not all. His heavenly restriction combined with this technique allowed him to store cursed energy surplus in the form of absolute mode, which is a giant mech that puts him on par with special grade sorcerers in terms of raw cursed energy output. Next is Momo with her tool manipulation, which allows her to control her broom. This allows her to fly and use her ability Wind Scythe, which is apparently pretty strong, but we never actually see it work. The title of tool manipulation implies that it might work on other cursed tools as well, but we never see this come to manifestation either. Following Momo is Kamo, who has the blood manipulation technique, which is the same ability as Choso, so we're just going to explain them at the same time. Blood manipulation is exactly what it sounds like. It allows the user to control their own blood. This can be done pretty much any way they want, but the most notable way is via piercing blood, which shoots the blood like a bullet. Other applications are Supernova, which is a buckshot that activates after piercing blood, glowing red scale, which raises the temperature of the user's body, allowing them to surpass their physical limits, and more. This technique of course has a huge drawback, as the user needs to keep track of their own blood or they will pass out or die from blood loss. The only exception being Death's paintings, as they can turn their cursed energy into blood. Coincidentally, this also makes reverse curse technique super easy for them to use. Next is another shared technique, the construction technique, shared by Mei and Yozoru. This is another technique that sounds exactly how it is. It allows the user to create things out of cursed energy. This ability inherently uses a lot of cursed energy, which some sorcerers would let hold them back. But not all. Mei is the one that got held back, but Yozoru actually became pretty competent with her technique after finding energy-efficient ideas in unique places like insects. This allowed her to fully utilize construction and showed that it's actually a pretty powerful technique, as she uses liquid metal to create things like insect armor or perfect sphere. Mei, on the other hand, made a single bullet. But you know who wasn't held back by their technique? Todo, who has the ability Boogie Woogie. This technique allows the user to swap the places of any two objects with cursed energy upon clapping their hands. This alone gives Todo a ton of flexibility, but it doesn't stop there, as after losing his hand, Todo adapted the technique to include a Vibroslap, essentially turning the technique into an unpredictable roulette as the Vibroslap switches its targets 50 times per second, effectively giving Todo complete control of the battlefield. There is the small issue that the Vibroslap is quite fragile, but that's still better than the alternative, which is no technique at all. It's time for our next disaster curse, Hanami, who has plant manipulation. This is, once again, as obvious as the name implies. Plant manipulation allows Hanami to control plants in a number of ways. The most notable way is via the roots they can summon and control, but they can also create these wooden balls that shoot spikes at a target, cursed buds which implant on the target and feed off their cursed energy, and a flower field which distracts literally anyone who steps inside it. There's also the flower on Hanami's arm, which absorbs life from the plants around them and uses it for their domain, which we never actually see. So let's move on to Gakuganji, whose ability seems to be music manipulation, kinda. He can basically imbue music with cursed energy to create different effects. We see it used for offense with an electric guitar and to enhance Utahime's technique with a traditional Japanese instrument. It's worth noting that we only see him use string instruments with his technique, so that might be part of it as well. Next are Eso and Kechizu, who have the Rot technique. This ability allows them to infect opponents with rot and decay, which will kill them after a matter of hours after the initial impact of their blood. Eso also has Wing King, which allows him to expel his blood in a large area of effect. It is a maximum technique, but it still kinda sucks. Now let's move from season 1 into the Hidden Inventories arc with Geto, who makes use of the Cursed Spirit Manipulation technique. This ability allows Geto to control cursed spirits, but there is a bit more to it. See, Geto needs to beat the cursed spirits to control them if they are above a certain strength. The general rule is if the spirit is within 2 levels of Geto, he must defeat them to capture it, but outside of that, he can capture them with no effort, with a few exceptions, such as cursed spirits that form a partnership with another cursed user. Once a spirit is under Geto's control, it is completely under his control, and he can do anything he wants with them, including forcing them to entertain his monologues as we saw with Kenjaku. These cursed spirits can also be reinforced with cursed energy to make them stronger, and the technique of course comes with a maximum technique in Uzumaki, which takes a bunch of cursed spirits and puts them into one massive attack. This ability also gives the user the abilities of grade 1 spirits and above for a one-time use. Next is Shoko, who we don't actually know the technique of. We just know she has one and it's healing related. Considering the series is now over, it seems like we will never know what this technique was. Another technique we don't have a ton of information on is Bagman's technique. This technique is cloning, but we don't know much about it besides that. He can create up to 5 clones at a time and also dissolve them at will. Gojo seemed to think the technique was really good, but we don't really see why. There was also this other Shikigami guy, but we never see what his Shikigami actually do, but I'm just gonna mention him so no one asks about him. Which means it's time to talk about Shibuya, where we have a ton of new abilities to talk about, like Ino's Auspicious Beast summons. This allows him to summon one of 4 Auspicious Beasts to use in combat. Number 1 is Kaichi, which is a levitating horn that homes in on the opponent. Number 2 is Reiki, which covers the user's body in water, acting as a cushion, and when applied to the feet, it increases Ino's mobility. Third is Kirin, which essentially lets Ino ignore all the pain he experiences while this technique is active. In exchange, it drains his stamina, and once the technique is deactivated, he is immobilized for a short amount of time. And fourth is Ryu, which is a dragon-like serpent that runs into opponents, dealing physical damage to them. It can get destroyed if enough damage is dealt to it. Next is Awasaka, aka Inverse Guy. Inverse is an ability that, when active, swaps the strength of all damage done to an opponent, so strong attacks become weak and weak attacks become strong. It is implied by Megumi that there is likely an upper limit for this technique, but we don't actually know what that upper limit is. Following Inverse Guy is Ogami with the Seance technique. This technique allows Ogami or one of her relatives to take on the appearance of a subject she acquires the body part of, but it doesn't work on those that have special bodies like Toji or Maki. But enough about her. It's time to talk about Jujutsu Kaisen's resident pedophilic incestuous thirst trap Dami Mommy, Mei Mei. She has the ability Black Bird Manipulation, which allows her to control birds like ravens and crows. This is mainly used for observation, as she can share the senses with the birds she controls, but she also has Bird Strike, which forces a bird into a binding vow, forcing the bird to kill itself by ramming into a target. No target that has been hit by a Bird Strike has lived to tell the tale, but there is a certain echelon of sorcerers that is too strong to be hit. This includes the likes of Gojo, Sukuna, and Kenjaku. Next is the Smallpox Deity. This curse spirit is actually one of the few characters to have a domain-based technique. In its domain, the opponent is forced into a box and crushed under a boulder. They have until the count of 3 to escape the box, and if they don't, they get inflicted with smallpox and die. If they do get out, the cycle restarts and repeats until they die or the curse curse is killed. The next sorcerer in Shibuya is Nobito, who makes use of the projection sorcery technique. Projection sorcery allows the user to split a second into 24 frames and draw a line in the frames. The sorcerer will then follow this line, and anything they touch during this second that doesn't move at 24 frames per second will get trapped in a frame of animation for 1 second. This ability allowed Nobito to gain the title of the fastest sorcerer in the modern era, besides Gojo. Noya also has this technique, but he doesn't do anything different from Nobito, so we don't have to talk about that sexist. But we do have to talk about the final disaster curse, Dagon. Dagon's ability is water manipulation, allowing the curse to expel huge amounts of water at once and also create barriers with it. To be honest though, we don't get to see that much of Dagon since he dies in his first fight. He does also have the technique Death Swarm, which is the guaranteed hit of his domain, allowing him to summon swarms of Shikigami that attack his opponents. It's unclear if this ability to summon Shikigami is limited to his domain or if he can use it outside as well. Dagon's domain is also where the antagonists met in the first season. Next we have the twins Nanako and Mimiko. Nanako's ability is photo manipulation, allowing her to control and change photos she takes with her phone. We see this used to save her and Mimiko from one of Jogo's attacks. Mimiko's ability is unnamed, but it basically treats her stuffed animal as a voodoo doll, as anything she does to the doll happens to her target. We mostly see this manifest as her hanging her opponents. Next is Haruta, whose ability is Miracle, which allows Haruta to survive a miracle in battle as many times as he has marks below his eyes. He can store up to 6 marks, and they are gained by removing small miracles in his daily life. And now we come to the final Kyoto student we see, Arata, whose ability is Painkiller. This ability is basically just a worse reverse curse technique, but it's still useful. When used, it prevents the subject's wounds from getting any worse and also numbs the pain of any active wounds. This allows them to keep fighting or eventually find the healing they need. Painkiller was actually the key to keeping both Nobara and Yuta alive, so it comes in pretty handy. Just imagine if it had a curse technique reversal though. Scary. Speaking of scary, next is Uraume, who uses Ice Formation. As the name implies, once again, Ice Formation allows Uraume to create and control ice. This can take the form of a giant gust of frost that can freeze multiple opponents at once, Icefall, which is a bunch of spikes that will fly at opponents telepathically, and this orb thing, which we never actually got to see in use. She can also freeze the limbs of opponents she touches directly, which would be useful in fights against pretty much anyone except Jackpot Hikari, who we'll be talking about pretty soon. But first, we have to talk about the man behind it all. No, not Gege himself, but Kenjaku. Kenjaku uses a number of curse techniques throughout the show, but only one is actually his own, body hopping. This technique allows Kenjaku to take over the bodies of those who have died, allowing him to live for over 1,000 years. He can also use the techniques belonging to the bodies he inhabits and also retains the abilities of the previous host. Kenjaku is also able to maintain the technique through curse technique burnout, although we don't know how. Probably has to do with his general freak factor. Speaking of freaks, next is Tengen. Tengen has the technique of immortality, but not like the cool, invincible immortality, just the kind that prevents them from dying of old age. This has resulted in them turning into a toe, and the sorcerer also requires a plasma star vessel every 500 years to prevent their evolution into a cursed spirit. Hey, wanna see if we can get through the Zenin clan faster than Maki did? Let's find out. First is Ogi, who has the ability Blazing Courage, which lights his sword on fire and also replaces part of his sword with flames if it gets broken. Next is Chojuru, who can make the earth clap its hands. Following Chojuru is Ranta, who can use his eyes to freeze people in place, and finally we have Junichi, who can make the sky rain with punches when he punches. Who do you think was faster, me or Maki? Let me know in the comments down below. For now, let's move on to Kirara, who has the ability Love Rendezvous. This ability allows Kirara to give 5 stars to 5 targets Kirara chooses. These are ordered in the order of the Southern Cross, and anyone who wants to approach one of the other stars must do so in the appropriate order. If they don't, they will get attracted to the correct star forcibly. It's kind of a confusing ability to watch in action, but once you know its secret, it's pretty easy to understand. Kind of like Hikari's, which is the next ability we are talking about. Hikari makes use of Idle Death Gambit, which is a non-lethal domain-based technique. The basic version is the domain allows Hikari to roll for the chance of unlimited cursed energy. This cursed energy does not change the size of his current cursed energy pool, but it does make it so he's always using his maximum cursed energy. It also gives him automatic reverse curse technique that can surpass even the likes of Gojo and Sukuna. The in-depth explanation is a bit more time-consuming to explain. Basically, upon opening his domain, Hikari starts the sequence to roll for immortality. In order order to roll, Hakari must first use an object in his domain such as doors or rubber balls. These objects will have a color coordinating with them to determine the likelihood of a successful roll. Hakari has no control over these colors. Once the likelihood is determined, we move to the roll scene. There are 4 different roll scenes, each one with their own probability of a successful roll. Then the roll happens. If it's successful, Hakari gains his bonus and the domain closes. If not, the cycle restarts. It's highly insinuated that Hakari can manipulate this probability, and as such, the actual roll is much lower than 1 in 239, but it cannot find the actual evidence for this in the manga besides Kashimo mentioning hidden probability. It just seems like Hakari is lucky. Now let's move into the culling games with a couple of Transformers, Hanyu and Haba. Both of them have the same basic ability, which turns their hair into aircraft, with Hanyu being an airplane and Haba being a helicopter. Their cursed energy is highly concentrated in their hair, meaning the rest of their body is quite weak. Next is Higuruma, who has our final domain-based technique, Deadly Sentencing. This domain-based technique is once again non-lethal, turning the domain into a courtroom, where Higuruma's opponent is put on trial for a crime they may or may not have committed. If the opponent is found guilty of a crime, a debuff will be applied, the main one we see being Confiscation, which removes cursed techniques from sorcerers or cursed energy if they do not have a cursed technique. We also see Death Penalty, which gives Higuruma access to the Executioner's Sword, a weapon that can kill anything in one hit. Or so it's said. We never see it actually make contact with anyone, so we don't really know. So let's move on to Megumi's part of Tokyo Colony number 1, starting with Remy. Remy is probably the worst sorcerer we see in the entire series. Her ability is awful, just turning her hair into a scorpion tail that we see do almost no damage. Next is Hazanoke, who has the ability to make his body parts explode. I think this technique comes with reverse curse technique as it's kind of required to use. Following Hazanoke is Chizuru, who has this claw hand. We never actually see what it does, so let's move on to Reggie. Reggie has the ability Contractual Recreation, which allows him to recreate any contracts he has partaken in. This mainly manifests in the form of receipts for things he has purchased. And with this technique, we have seen him summon everything from houses to knives. It even works on receipts for non-tangible things like spas, which will recreate the effects of the item on the receipt. And the final character introduced in Tokyo Colony number 1 is Takiba, who has the ability Comedian. This ability is kind of crazy. It allows anything Takiba finds funny to happen. And when I say anything, I mean anything. From small gags to altering reality, it's even said that this ability can rival Gojo. This means it's, in theory, the strongest ability in the show, but in the hands of Takiba, it's just good. See, Takiba isn't really a fan of dark humor or death, and as such, nothing that bad is going to happen when he uses it. From here, we move into Sendai, which means it's finally time to talk about Yuta and his ability, Copy. Copy is exactly what it sounds like. It allows Yuta to copy any curse technique as long as the conditions have been fulfilled. What are those conditions? Well, first and foremost, Rika must consume a part of the original user, be it an arm or a leg or a finger. Just something will let her store the ability for Yuta to use. But stronger abilities require more of a piece of a person, with lethal amounts being required for the upper echelon of techniques. This technique is strong, but it does come with a few drawbacks. First of all, if a user regenerates the body part that was eaten, Yuta loses access to the technique. And if Rika doesn't consume enough of the technique, the amount of times he can use it is limited. On top of this, he can only access his techniques when he's fully connected to Rika or when he's in his domain, but in his domain it is random which techniques he can use. Next in Sendai is Kuroushi, who has Cockroach Manipulation. As the ability sounds, this technique allows Kuroushi to control a swarm of cockroaches. This is actually pretty dangerous as it is able to consume a non-sorcerer in a matter of seconds. On top of this, he also carries the Festering Life Blade, which injects insects into his opponents, and he can use Earth and Insect Trance to temporarily blind his opponents as well. Oh, and most importantly, he can actually preserve his life via Parthenogenesis, which allows him to create a second version of himself separate from his original body. Next is Uro with Sky Manipulation. Once again, exactly as it sounds. This technique allows Uro to treat the sky as a surface, manipulating space however she likes. She uses this mostly to redirect attacks or to fly, but she can also crack the sky on an opponent with Thin Ice Breaker, doing major damage to pretty much any opponent, but probably not quite as much damage as the direct hit from our next technique, Granite Blast, which belongs to Ryu. Ryu's main technique is Cursed Energy Expulsion, allowing him to output enormous amounts of cursed energy at once. Granite Blast is how he outputs it. It is a giant blast of cursed energy that covers an entire building and works really well for him most of the time. Ryu actually holds the record for the most cursed energy expended at one time, and because of the nature of his technique, he does not suffer from normal technique burnout after using his domain. He's a pretty competent sorcerer, but you know who's not? Charles from Tokyo Colony number 2. Charles actually has the last ability we are introduced to in the Culling games, that being his Precognition Transfiguration ability. Yeah, every other ability we see after this has already been shown. Charles's ability is tied directly to his cursed tool, G War Staff. As Charles fights and injures his opponent, the War Staff will fill up with their blood. Once enough of their blood is absorbed, Charles can put a panel on his opponent, each panel allowing him to see 1 second into the future. So with 1 panel, he sees 1 second into the future, and with 10, he sees 10 seconds. Pretty self-explanatory. From here we move to the weird little arc between the Culling Games and the fight against Sukuna. This little arc actually has 4 new techniques, the first of which being Ganesha's. We don't know much about this ability, but it is described as being able to remove obstacles. The only time we see this used was against the soldiers in the US military, so it's really hard to know the extent of this thing's power, but it is a special grade cursed spirit, so it's probably pretty high. Next is Kenjaku's secondary ability, Anti-Gravity System, or I guess his tertiary ability if you consider body hopping to be an active technique. This technique originally belonged to Yuji's mom, Koroi, and it allows the user to nullify the effects of gravity when used, but we mostly see its curse technique reversal used, which enforces a high gravitational pull in the immediate area surrounding Kenjaku. It's a pretty good ability, but it's not quite as good as our next technique, Star Rage, the ability belonging to Yuki Tsukumo. Star Rage is one of my favorite abilities in the show because it's so broken but so simple. It allows Yuki to apply virtual mass to herself, meaning that her attacks do massive damage as if she was much more massive herself with no actual detriment to herself. This allowed her to one-shot a special grade cursed spirit and break the Star Corridor. But what makes this ability truly broken is that the mass eventually does start affecting Yuki, and there's no limit to the amount of mass Yuki can add to herself, meaning she can effectively become a black hole. This is the single strongest attack in the show, but it does come with a huge cost as it will consume Yuki as well. Next we have a potential special grade, an Angel. Angel's technique is Technique Extinguishment, which allows her to nullify any curse techniques she uses her technique on. We mostly see her use this ability in the form of Jacob's Ladder, which seems to be just one application of the technique. Jacob's Ladder is used primarily on 2 occasions. The first is to open the prison realm, and the second is to do damage to Sukuna while he's in Megumi's vessel, but Angel does say that she uses this technique to kill reincarnated sorcerers as well. Next is Utahime with her ability Forbidden Area 0, which essentially buffs people in her direct radius. She can improve the strength of this technique by including dance, hand signs, chant, and external music. When fully powered, this ability allows her to boost her allies by a total of 20%. Not that impressive, but now we go to the opposite end of the power spectrum, because it's time to talk about Kashimo. Kashimo's main ability is Mystic Beast Amber, an ability that allows him to control all aspects of electricity at the cost of destroying his body on its deactivation. This means the ability is of course a one-time use, but it's really strong. When I say all aspects of electricity, I mean all. From EMP blasts to charging his body to surpass his physical limits, to using his lightning discharge at will. The applications seem close to endless, but we only get to see it one time, so it's kind of hard to tell. You know what ability we actually get to see way more than one time? Ui's Translocation ability. This ability is pretty cool in my opinion. It essentially allows Ui to move targets to places and people that he has previously marked. This alone would be very useful, but he can also swap the souls of people that he has marked as long as he has their permission. He does this by not opening the boxes that are his targets, and therefore the souls do not get altered in any way. This technique was the secret behind how the entire cast got so strong in a matter of weeks. It's kinda crazy how important this 12-year-old is. But the next technique is a little bit weirder. It's Larue's Heart Catch. This ability essentially allows Larue to throw a giant hand, which he can use as, well, a hand. In combat, this ability is actually pretty good for support as it can restrain opponents pretty easily and do anything else a hand can do. Any damage the hand sustains is bounced back to Larue at 10% the original damage. The real advantage of this technique though comes in his secondary technique, Cutie Honey, which allows Larue to draw the full attention of someone who has experienced his technique to him. This is pretty broken in any combat situation, and it was even effective against Sukuna, so that's how you know it's guaranteed. Next is Larue's partner in crime, Miguel, who has the ability Prayer Song. By dancing to the beat etched in his heart, Miguel can both buff himself and debuff his opponents. Beyond this, we don't really know much about it, including how much of a buff or debuff it applies. And finally, we come to our last technique, which belongs to Yuji Itadori. He has Shrine and Blood Manipulation, which we already covered, but he also has Soul Punches, which allow him to do damage directly to the soul of his opponents. Damage to the soul is much harder to heal than regular damage, and only one person has ever been seen healing soul damage with Reverse Curse technique, and that was Sukuna, so it's likely not something that is easy to pull off. This ability was developed by Yuji thanks to having Sukuna in his body while fighting Mahito, as it allowed him to better identify his soul as well as his opponents. Yuji also seems to have a knack for hitting black flashes, but it's not actually related to his techniques at all. As far as we know, he just gets really lucky. And that's every technique. Or at least, it would be, if it wasn't for this dude who was introduced in the last chapter. He has the ability to change people's eyes or something. We don't know what this actually does besides make people look a little bit weird. Yeah, kinda crazy that this is the final technique of the series. And that's all of them. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I'll see you next week for a not Jujutsu Kaisen video. So maybe I won't see you. Whatever. See you then.